why don't you, you have a lot of stuff going on. So why don't you introduce yourself and your podcast and the research that you do on these serial killers and these cold cases.
Yeah, so I'm pretty much started out, as not a blogger necessarily, but a little bit of writing and stuff, and then I eventually launched a blog that I've been putting off for a while. Launched it this year, February, and then I sort of was working with some people on the podcast angle, and luckily I got linked up with Mike Ferguson, and he hosts True Crime All the Time and True Crime All the Time Unsolved, and we both got together and talked, and we felt there's a good fit there for us to do a podcast. So we just launched our podcast, Criminology, but before that, I did a lot of research on the Zodiac killer, especially. That's one of the biggest cases that I've researched. I've done that for 10 years, and then there's a lot of different cold cases here and there that that's one of the passions that I have is the cases that are forgotten, not the ones that are in the news like every day. It's the ones that, sort of like you guys with Maura Murray, the ones that get lost someplace and then, 5-10 years later, they're forgotten about. So that's what I like to spend time looking into. And then more recently, I've gotten heavily involved in the Golden State Killer case, which, led to going to CrimeCon and stuff. So that's what I'm doing now.
That's right. So we crossed paths at CrimeCon, but didn't really get to speak. All this stuff is real interesting. All the things that you cover, Zodiac Killer site and your site, True Crime Guy, a lot of good information there. I like the podcast as well, Criminology. So you're talking about the Zodiac Killer case on Criminology to start, right?
Yeah, and what was good about that was, starting off a podcast, I've got all this years of information and reports and files, and I was like, I might as well put this to use and make it a little bit easier for starting off. So that's, Mike also liked that case, so that's one that we decided to go with together, and luckily we have a good amount of material to work with to get started here.
Tim has said to me we should really cover the Zodiac on a couple of the Crawlspace Cellar series, or get into that. And I love the Zodiac case. I love the Boston Strangler case, but I get so overwhelmed and really the work that people like yourself put into it. I feel like we'd be like even worse than the Wikipedia page on it. If people would go to us and just get barely a glimpse of it in 45 minutes or an hour. So yeah, the work you do on that is phenomenal. When did you start doing that? When did you look at the Zodiac and say that's the one I want?
It was when I was I grew up in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s, and I had one of those weird fascinations, I guess, with serial killers. And I remember getting a book. I don't even know where I got it from, but it was about serial killers. And I turned to the page, it had an article on Zodiac, and I said, "Wow, that really sounds sinister." The name sounds sinister. So I went out and got the Robert Graysmith book and did a book report on it. And I've been pretty much interested in it ever since. And then I launched the website, and I was able to make some contacts in law enforcement and get access to some different things that helped me along the way research the case. And it's one of those cases where you just get sucked into it, and it's hard to get out of it. So
yeah,
that's what it's been for me for a good many years now.
If you remember, what did you get for a grade on the book report?
Oh, I think it was a B-, and I don't remember the exact grade, but I remember the comment she made. She put in the score was real low, but in big, bold print, she said, "Subject matter," with a big question mark. So, and she didn't explain what it was, so I sort of think she just didn't like me doing a report about that. But that's the thing that sticks out to me, not so much the grade.
Which is probably better than the grade.
Hey, I did the work. It was something that I researched. I read the whole book, did the report, and she didn't say we couldn't cover serial killers, so that's the one I did.
And then she went down to the principal and was like, "Reassign this kid from my class, please."
Yeah.
So you mentioned Robert Graysmith. So he wrote one of the books about the Zodiac. And so how do you feel about this guy? Because I know he's kind of controversial. Like, let's get right into this.
Well, Robert Graysmith started off when he wrote Zodiac. He wasn't a professional writer. He wasn't an author. It's just something that he, like a lot of us, just got sucked into and then said, you know what, I'm going to write a book. So I think he's done some things where, there's some errors possibly in his book that some people interpret as him misleading people. I tend to think it's more amateur writer making some mistakes. He wasn't a professional researcher. So I think he made some mistakes along the way, and those have been, a lot of people like to jump on them. I think it was more harmless than anything intentional. But, because of his book, that's why me and a lot of other people, are into this case and what got us started.
And I know the Zodiac movie, David Fincher's movie that came out about 10 years ago, is a favorite of mine. And Graysmith is, of course, a character in that. He's the guy played by Jake Gyllenhaal.
Are you one of the people that have the of the school of thought that the Zodiac was, this is for anybody who is just discovering you, was he a singular killer who singularly taunted the police, or was it two or three people that possibly just capitalized on the publicity, or one man who capitalized on what were probably just regular crimes, muggings, the shooting of the cab driver. What was the cab driver's name?
Paul Stein.
Paul Stein, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, my personal opinion, he was just, a lone nut, a guy that didn't get much attention in everyday life and fantasized about being somebody bigger than he was. And, I think when he started out, obviously he was disturbed because he's going out and killing people. But I think the killing became, an afterthought. I think the letters and the interaction with the press and stuff and the attention he was getting, I think that became more of his main focus. From a victim total, he didn't kill that many people that we know of, but he wrote letters for, 5 years, essentially. So I think that was primarily the motivation for him.
So you think it was one guy?
One lone nut job.
How come he was never caught?
I think he was lucky. I think that was part of it. I mean, he'd never get away with it today. He'd be caught pretty quickly today. But I think he was lucky was the biggest thing. And he literally was missed by a minute. At Paul Stein's murder scene, he went around the block, and literally the first cop pulled up immediately afterwards. And then when he was walking down Jackson Street, getting away from the cab, a police car drove, down the same road as him. They stopped and slowed down and looked at him, but they had put out a be on the lookout for a black male, and somehow they had mistakenly put that out there, or else he would have been stopped right there probably. So luck was on his side, and he wasn't a master criminal, I don't think. But it's one of the fascinating things is not knowing, who he is, or that way everybody's theories are can be right.
We recently spoke to Billy Jensen, who is a criminal, is an investigative journalist, and he's got a real heavy focus on unsolved cases and a real heavy focus on unidentified murder victims and unsolved murders. And he is of the belief that it is much easier to get away with murder today. And a lot of people say, like you just said, if he was doing this today, he would be caught, pretty quickly. But if he's smart enough to do what he's doing, he would adapt to what he needs to do today to get away with it. There's a lot more people out there in the world. There's a lot more information, whether it's intentional or not, that can tell you how to get away with murder. I mean, if you kill somebody and dispose their body in pieces across state lines, you can pretty much get away with murder. There's a lot of bodies that just lay in morgues that go unidentified for years and years, and sometimes forever. Do you think that if the Zodiac were around today in his prime, that he would adapt to those circumstances? On
one hand, you're definitely right, because you could listen to any number of different podcasts, like all of ours that are out there, and learn from what previous people have done to get away with crimes and adapt and use things like that. But on the other hand, I think he was pretty impulsive. I think he, at the very first crime scene, he literally started shooting 30 seconds after a witness passed him. You would think that maybe he's going to hold off and say, all right, somebody just went by, I'm not going to start shooting right now, but he didn't waste any time. So I think he's a little bit impulsive. And I think what makes it harder to get away with what he did was, in today's standards, there's like a camera on every corner. I just think at some point he'd slip up, but they'd get a license plate, something. And, with DNA advancements and stuff like that now, I just think there's too much working against him to pull something off like he did back then today.
You mentioned if he'd listened to podcasts, maybe he'd have an easier time getting away with it. I find that pretty interesting. I wonder if murderers are the kind of people who do listen to podcasts, or vice versa. I kind of get the feeling that most murderers don't know that much about this stuff. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think there's many murderers out there listening to true crime podcasts because they're out there living it. They're out there doing the stuff that everybody else is talking about on these podcasts. So I don't think they necessarily have an interest in listening to the podcast when they can just go out there and do what we're all talking about.
What are you going to listen to when you're in your car stalking your victim?
Well, yeah, I don't know. Me personally, I'd put on some heavy metal music or something. I don't know, but maybe they listen to true crime podcasts just to remind themselves, I can't do this because that's how this guy got caught or something.
Wouldn't it be easier to get away with a murder if someone who knew a bunch of facts about true crime, who listened to a bunch of these shows, watched a lot of Oxygen Network and certain crime networks, if a true crime podcaster decided to go into murdering or try it once in a while, they'd probably have an easier time getting away with it than just some typical murderer.
I would think so. I'd agree with you. I would think so, but in the heat of the moment, something like that happens. Maybe you don't even think clearly. Maybe you're not thinking about other things. The only thing I've learned that I would remember, not that I'm planning on killing anybody, but leave your cell phone at home, because it seems like they always triangulate somebody's cell phone, to a murder victim or something. So
that's right. We actually talked about doing an episode about the perfect murder and how we would do it. But we haven't recorded it yet because I feel like it might be dangerous.
Yeah, you never know.
There might be responsible.
Yeah,
I think most of the listeners out there are pretty sane, but you never know if there's one that's capable of listening to something you say and using it. So
let me ask a kind of a wild theory here that I heard and that I really kind of liked, at least listening to. I don't know if I subscribe in it. But the idea that Zodiac is also the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski? How do you feel about this theory?
Yeah, that I personally don't buy it. I mean, I think his DNA and whatever evidence and timeline, I'm sure they've dissected that and put that under a microscope, and I just can't see it being him. Obviously he's a killer, but he liked to kill from a distance. Zodiac liked to get right up close and get his hands dirty, I guess. And Ted Kaczynski liked to leave a bomb and run off and let his destruction happen after that. The interesting thing is, though, he was in California at certain times around the Zodiac case. I don't know his exact timeline, and his handwriting actually looks similar in some aspects to Zodiac's. But again, I just think if there was anything there to be found linking him, it would have been found. He doesn't look anything like the sketch or anything like the description of Zodiac. So, I'm pretty confident it wasn't him.
And when people talk about the handwriting looking similar, I mean, both of them tried to mask their handwriting style by kind of doing block letters, right?
Yeah, Ted Kaczynski's I don't know about. I've actually seen some writing samples of Ted's that were just like notes. I don't know if they got them, for evidence or found them wherever they found them, but he had some notes that he had just handwritten that weren't threatening notes. It was just like a grocery list or something like that. So I think he wrote in his everyday writing. Zodiac's, I think the writing, and there's a lot of writing out there that you can find online for him, but I think that's his everyday writing. I think he just, I think he was such a loner and so alone or whatever that nobody really even recognized his handwriting. That's my personal opinion. I don't think it's disguised. I think the writing you see is his real writing.
What about the cipher that Zodiac sent to the police that seemed to potentially spell out Theodore Kaczynski? And he had said that, if you could solve this cipher, you will have my name.
That cipher was definitely solved, and there's nothing about Ted Kaczynski in it. Now, at the end of the cipher, there's like a leftover bunch of symbols, and there's a certain amount of characters. I think it's 17 or 18 leftover symbols, whatever it is. But, a lot of people have tried to anagram that into all kinds of different names. I've never heard of it being Ted Kaczynski, but somebody that's maybe a Ted Kaczynski supporter as Zodiac, maybe they've tried to fit that in there. I think the most common belief of, for cipher experts anyways, is that it was just leftover, symbols to make the cipher appear more uniform. And it doesn't mean anything, but there's people that have tried to re-scramble those symbols around and make some words out of them for sure.
Okay, so let me get this straight. What you're saying right now is that the Zodiac was a very personal killer and he killed people up close, and Ted Kaczynski killed people from a distance, and if by chance they happen to be the same person, then we'd be talking about potentially the most interesting and prolific serial killer of all time.
You'd be right. If he turned out somehow to be the Zodiac, then that'd be a big story for sure.
I'm not sure how I don't know if you've been working in the White House press office, but I'm not sure how you just made his complete denial that he believed in that into. So what you're saying is it's such a long shot that if it were true.
Thank you. I was working on that spin for a minute there.
Is Sean Spicer in this room?
He's writing for us now.
I think that's what the leftover symbols spell is Sean Spicer.
Okay. Or Ted Cruz, because the Ted Cruz the Zodiac stuff was going around. But
oh yeah. Oh, that's good. So what you said that you looked at some samples of? I think it's great that you called the Unabomber Ted. You looked at some examples of Ted's writing, and you've seen, you've spoken to the police about the Zodiac. Can you talk a little bit about the interaction that you've had with law enforcement and what their reaction is, and what you have to say to get your eyes and hands on some of this evidence?
It's a mixed bag when you talk to investigators about the Zodiac case, because half of them are 30 years old, 35 years old, and they weren't even alive when the case was happening. Half of them don't know a lot about the case. They get stuck where it's like a rotating thing for 6 months or 12 months. It's their turn to manage the case, and then after 6 or 12 months, they'll rotate it to another detective. So most of the detectives that I talk to are not happy to have it, because I think what it brings out is it brings out a lot of nut jobs that come out with these wacky, crazy theories, and I think they have to take them, they're the tips and stuff that come in, they have to at least look at them, note them, whatever they got to do with them, but it costs them time to do that stuff. And I think for a lot of investigators, they just don't want the Zodiac case on their plate. And I've talked to several of them, but there's been one in Napa, there's one in Vallejo that were interested and worked the case, enthusiastically, and that are still hoping it's solved, and felt, I don't want to say honored to have the case, but felt like it was their duty to try and solve the case just as if it was a fresh case.
How do you even know when it's right to pick up the phone or to visit the police, to visit law enforcement, to say, I feel like it's appropriate right now, and what I have to ask them is going to be worth their time?
Most of the time I'll start off saying, I run a Zodiac site, I have people that email me with tips and theories and whatnot. And if it's something that looks like it could be legit, I'll pass it along, because for all we know, they might have that tip or that information already in the case file someplace, so it might be something that they're interested in. But luckily, I've been introduced to enough people where I can call them up and say, hey, I'm Mike Morford, and so recommended me to call you. And once I drop a name, then they're usually okay. They're usually, okay, no problem. And then they're willing to talk with me and stuff.
And just by talking to you now, it's apparent that you're a level-headed human being. And you have obviously thought about that attitude when you approach law enforcement. We've been trying to, because we see this like big influx in the armchair detectives and the citizen detectives, and all of a sudden it becomes a responsibility to say, when we have people like yourself on, to really push that, don't contact law enforcement if you have this gut feeling. Contact law enforcement when, like you said, you had a reference and you contacted them and said, hey, this guy thinks that I should talk to you. I run a website. I get a lot of tips. Really, really like vet all of your information. And how you must have a ton of information. Is it tempting at all to run have your emotions run away with that and pick up the phone and call law enforcement? Like, how do you control your emotions in this?
Well, you can look at something and get wrapped up in it, or get a gut feeling that, hey, this guy needs to be looked at closer, and I might shoot a couple emails over and say, hey, this so-and-so gave me this name, so-and-so this, and I'll forward that over to my contacts, and they'll shoot me an email back, and sometimes we'll call up and talk on the phone about it. But you're right. You don't want to hit them up with every little, tidbit, every little feeling that you have, because at some point it's like the boy that cried wolf. You call them 30 times with 30 different names and stuff, they're going to start not taking you seriously. And the problem is, a case like the Zodiac case is a cold case. There's not much going on with it. It's almost 50 years. It's probably not going to be solved. And when these detectives have to spend time on it, it takes away from fresh cases that they can be working on that actually have a good chance of being solved.
What have been some of the more interesting tips, or what is the most interesting thing that's come in through the website?
I've gotten a couple names that, when I looked them up, they were pretty interesting, and I forward them, to police. But then it's not even so much those; it's the crazy theories that come in. Like, they come up with this scientific thing, like it was a full moon this night, and they just come up with this wild theory, and all of a sudden it's a scientific algebraic theory that they come up with, and it's like you can't even understand what they're talking about. So it's like, I'm not going to send this to the police. It's bonkers, So things like that come in a lot, unfortunately. But once in a while I get a good name or something that has some good information along with it. I'll send that over to police.
And what do you think happened? Who do you think is the Zodiac killer?
My personal opinion, and again, I don't want to, for the podcast that we're doing, we want to be really neutral about it and just lay the facts of the case out there and that kind of stuff. But as far as my personal opinion, I don't want to push on anybody. My opinion is it was a guy named Ross Sullivan that was the Zodiac. I don't want to take a 10-minute detour here and explain why, but that's a guy that you can Google, and you'll find enough on the internet about him, and why he might be a good suspect.
Wow.
But just like every suspect, though, there's there's pros and cons, and you have to really be careful when you're throwing somebody's name out there. Of course, most of the suspects are dead by now, so you don't have to really worry about getting sued by them or anything like that. But you don't want to throw somebody's name out there without having some good reason to suspect that they could be responsible.
Was Ross Sullivan a character in the Zodiac movie?
No, Ross Sullivan, he's never been mentioned in the book, the movie, anything like that.
I was going to say, it's interesting because most people go with Arthur Lee Allen or Rick Marshall. And when you said that, I thought for sure you were going to say Arthur Lee Allen, because that's pretty much where most people end up, where they after they look into this. I know you don't want to take a huge detour on it, but what brings you to that conclusion?
Again, the Zodiac case is so long and so many pieces to it, but essentially there's a link, and I don't want to give it away for anybody from the podcast that's going to be listening, but there's a link to Riverside in Southern California, which is 6-7 hours south of San Francisco, where Zodiac was killing. But there's a link down there to a library for Zodiac, and come to find out Ross Sullivan worked in that library, And then, a couple years ago, we finally got a picture of him. We had read some stuff about him. His name popped up in a couple reports and stuff. We finally got a picture of him, and he's like the spitting image of the infamous Zodiac sketch. So putting those two things together, in my mind, they're pretty strong things. And again, there's things that don't fit either. I don't tend to go down a blind alley and just stick with somebody no matter what. I look at the pros and cons. So, there's certain things that don't fit about them, but those are two things that really fit that are, from there, I think are pretty important.
And Lance, I know you had looked into the Zodiac killer case a lot more than I have. So was that a name that you had ever heard before?
No. I'd always looked at Arthur Lee Allen. Of course, I'd looked into him before we started doing this podcast and before we started understanding the nuances and the obvious things you should do when you're looking into open cases. So I looked at Arthur Lee Allen and Rick Marshall and really focused on them and was like, how can I prove in my own head that these guys were one of them was the Zodiac killer? And again, at that point, I realized the Zodiac was so dense, and we started to get into Maura's case and Brianna's case and the Dean case Mike, you've got this, like, you're cool with doing this. We don't need to interfere. But all of that being said, no, I'd never heard that until you just said that.
Yeah, and he's only been a suspect for the last couple of years, but Rick Marshall and Arthur Lee Allen have been suspects since Robert Graysmith's book came out, and the movie is based on the book, Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. So it's essentially the movie is the film version of the book, and he focuses on Allen for the most part. He was interested in Marshall, but then he got focused on Allen. So in his book, he steered towards Allen as if Allen was the Zodiac, and that's where the book wound up going. He actually wrote a sequel called Zodiac Unmasked, and that's when he mentioned Allen by name, and that's what the movie is based on. So if you watch the first 45 minutes or so of the movie Zodiac, it's pretty much about the murders themselves, but the other hour and a half, 2 hours of it is mainly focused on the hunt for Zodiac and Arthur Lee Allen himself.
God, it's such a good movie.
It's a great movie. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorites too.
Even though it's one of your favorites, do you get frustrated with the direction that it goes, just focusing on just a couple, or do you realize that there's so much to it, it's so dense that there's no way, and it is based on Graysmith's book?
Yeah, I don't get frustrated. It is what it is. It's the history of the case. Again, in my mind, unfortunately, I think the case is going to go unsolved. That being said, there's some things working. I can't really say what they are right now, but there's some things working, that I've heard through the grapevine that might lead to some additional clues coming out. I don't know that it's going to solve the case, but, I know they're definitely working on some stuff regarding the case that could bring some more clues to surface.
Great.
Such as?
Yeah, can you explain them all to us right now?
I could say it's, from what I understand, it's related to DNA. That's about all I can say about it. I can't say too much about how it's related, but...
Cool. Would you know when there'll be an update on that?
I'm actually waiting to get one back now, an update on it. This is a couple months ago I first heard about it, and I haven't heard too much more, so I'm actually emailed somebody the other day. I'm waiting to get a response and just see where that stands.
Who do you email? And what do you email? Do you say, hey, what's going on with this Zodiac DNA?
Yeah, I don't want to drop any names, but, I have somebody that I, every once a month or every few weeks or something, we'll get on the phone or we'll shoot some emails back and forth, and they'll tell me where they're at with certain things, and I'll say, hey, what's going on with this? So, but unfortunately, a lot of it I can't share and put out there because it's supposed to be confidential. So you guys know how it is, working on the cases you're working on. If you hear something from an inside source, you'd love to be able to put it out there, say, hey, this is what I heard, but it's not something that you can do without burning your contact.
Right. Lance usually waits till the very end of the episode to do it.
And I just slip it in.
Hey, by the way.
Yeah. Yep. And then we cut, hard cut. If you could, I have one more question about Zodiac. I don't know if you want to move on from Zodiac, but I have one more question about Zodiac. If you could take one of Zodiac's ciphers or letters or cards that he sent to the police or to the media and make it into, say, like a birthday card for a loved one, what would it be?
If I gave my loved one something from Zodiac, I'd probably get divorced. I'd probably give it to my wife just as a joke because she gets creeped out by some of that stuff. But I'd probably, he sent a Halloween card to reporter Paul Avery, which was in the movie. I think that would be a great gag to play on somebody.
Tim, you're a busy guy. I'm a busy guy. Sometimes during the day, you don't have time for lunch and you get hungry. And before you know it, you're super hungry and you want to grab something quick on the run. And protein bars are good. But is there something out there that's a whole food protein bar? You know, something that is made with 100% whole ingredients and is completely transparent about what's in their bars?
Funny you ask. RX Bar's core ingredients do all the talking. It's simply like eating 3 egg whites, 2 dates, and 6 almonds with no BS. This is a brand new protein bar. It is delicious. Turns out real food ingredients actually taste really good. Whether you like sweet or savory, chocolate or fruit flavors, there is an RX bar for you.
But I don't want a protein bar that just offers me like 2 or 3 varieties. That gets boring.
It comes in 11 delicious flavor varieties. No added sugar, no artificial colors, artificial flavors, preservatives, or fillers.
Now, recently I thought that I might have an allergy to like gluten or soy or dairy. It's probably all in my head, but I just want to be safe.
This is the perfect snack at your office or breakfast on the go. They taste delicious.
Oh, you know what this would be great for? You know that I work out like nonstop. I mean, to get this Adonis figure, and is there that this would be perfect for my my pre and post, and perhaps because they go long, my during workout snacks.
Yeah, sure. For 25% off your first order, visit rxbar/crawl and enter promo code CRAWL at checkout.
I'm so excited. I'm going to go to RXBAR, that's rxbar.com/crawl. Promo code is CRAWL.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit to let's talk about the Golden State Killer. Now, I know you were at CrimeCon, and we mentioned earlier we kind of crossed paths, but didn't really get to talk at CrimeCon. But so you were there on a Golden State Killer panel. Tell us about this.
The Golden State Killer, for anybody out there listening that's not familiar with the case, is California's worst prolific serial offender, if not the country's. It's a guy that committed 50 rapes and a dozen murders, and is still uncaught. Compared to him, Zodiac was a minnow compared to him. It's night and day difference. He came into people's houses, tied them up, raped them, murdered them. So it's a little bit of a different killer. And what had happened was he never had a really good name. He was the East Area Rapist, and then he was the original Night Stalker, and then he became the Golden State Killer. That's finally the name that most of us use now. But, it was a case that a lot of people just weren't aware of. And they're like, how can this be like California's worst serial killer? And I've never heard of him. So what happened was, a couple years back, I'm going to guess it was about 2 years ago maybe, Michelle McNamara and I used to correspond about some different cases we had some interest in, and we'd shoot some emails back and forth. And we used to talk about Zodiac, but she sort of moved on from Zodiac, and she had really gotten hooked on the Golden State Killer. And she sent me an email and asked if I'd be interested in, jumping into that case the way that I jumped into Zodiac, because, there's a lot more material there. There's a lot of stuff a lot of clues and stuff. And at the time, I was really busy with the Zodiac stuff and some other stuff I was working on, and I had I turned her down. And then unfortunately she wound up dying, last year, and at that point I sort of, felt, guilty for not taking her up on the offer to look into the case. So at that point, once she passed away, I was like, what, I'm gonna go ahead and look into the case. And I wound up digging, and I got in contact with some of the law enforcement, contacts, I guess, that I was given, and start a little dialogue with them. And then one thing led to another, and then so I was able to get a lot of information, and there's a good site, a good Golden State Killer site on Pro Boards. It's a forum, and on there I was able to make friends with a couple surviving victims, Jane Carson Sandler, and she was actually the 5th rape victim that survived. But then on the forum was Debbie Domingo. She's the daughter of one of the murder victims. And also on the forum was Michelle Cruz, and her sister was Janelle Cruz, and she was the last victim of the Golden State Killer. And we just got to talking a little bit, and I'm going to guess it was back in February maybe. I heard about CrimeCon. I said, well, I'm definitely going to this. I said, this sounds way too cool not to go to it. And, I didn't have any ambitions about doing anything. I just wanted to go there and meet some people and check out the stuff. And I reached out to them. I said, why don't you see if CrimeCon will take you guys and have you there to talk about this case and bring some attention to it. So they said, well, that sounds like a good idea. So they actually reached out to CrimeCon, and CrimeCon was receptive, and they said, yeah, we'd love to have you out there. So, they got together and said, we're going to go. But they reached back out to me, the ladies did, and they're like, Mike, can you come along with us and come on stage with us and be part of this, which was really a big honor. It's not something I was planning on, but I said, yeah, I definitely would do that for you. So at the presentation we did, I don't know if you guys were in there for that part of it, but essentially each of the ladies gave a personal story about how a rapist and murderer affected their lives. And I followed those. It's hard to follow them up, but we did the presentation. I followed up last and did a really good attempt to try and put as much material out about the case as possible. And it was crazy. I think we had 300 or 400 people in there, I'm going to guess, but at the end of it, there was just people coming up the stage. Oh, I never heard about this. I never heard about that. Can you tell me more about that? It was just weird. And then we went back to the booth, and there was just a slew of people coming over asking questions. There were people crying, hearing the stories that these 3 brave women are telling on stage. It was moving to people to tears. So that was something that was a real honor to be part of. It wasn't something I planned on doing, but I'm really glad I did.
That's incredible. I talk about an honor, right? To be invited by these not direct victims, but very secondary victims to this. The original Night Stalker is the Golden State Killer. Is the most prolific serial killer in your opinion, or is it a fact in America?
I'm not going to say America. I'm definitely going to say probably California. It's not just the murders. He's got 12 murders. I'm sure there's serial killers out there with bigger numbers, but it's the 50 rapes that are really disturbing too. To go in to somebody's house and get away with that at least 50 times on top of the 12 murders. And the sad thing is if he's caught today, he can't even be tried for the rapes. It's all about the murders. But there's some good hope that they're going to catch him. And he's young enough that he, unlike Zodiac, he's young enough he probably could still be alive, and they're working hard to catch him.
Yeah, so he can't be charged for the rapes because of the statute of limitation on the crime of rape, which is completely fucked up.
Yeah.
That has to be in the category of, that has to be changed. It has to be in the category, murder has no statute of limitations. Rape, especially when it's when you have invaded the home. It's a premeditated rape. That has to be changed. There has to be no statute of limitations on that. That's absolutely crazy that he could get away with, what did you say, 50 rapes if he was caught today. because just time ran out. I just decided to stop doing it.
Yeah, and you know, from what I've heard, and you know, I don't want to speak bad of the police. I never want to do that, but from what I understand, as soon as the statute of limitations was out on the rapes, you know, Sacramento was where he started. They pretty much threw out most everything associated with the rapes. So they lost a lot of different files and reports, and who knows what kind of clues were in there and stuff. So, you know, it's playing catch up basically at this point, trying to, you know, see what suspects they have, if they've already been looked at, ruled out, or whatever.
Now, I feel like this would be something where if you were to contact Sacramento, which I'm sure you have, I feel like this could be something where the statute of limitations is running out. They might welcome some sort of citizen detective to come along and say, I'll do the legwork for you. You guys do your, you know, I know you can't allocate men and budget to this case, but, you know, just tell me, you know, what I need to know as I need to know it, and I'll try to put the pieces together, especially after looking at your track record. You know, you're not going to go out and make you're not going to exploit this.
Yeah, I mean, and they're getting a lot of tips, not just, you know, me talking to them or anything. And I actually did turn in, you know, the contact that I have in law enforcement, I was able to give them a pretty good amount of names that I developed for one reason or another, and they checked a bunch of them out, and one of them was actually elevated to a DNA collection based on what I gave him. So, and you know, it took I think 8 or 9 months, but he got ruled out. He's a pretty good, you know, suspect in my mind. But after that, I just moved on and kept going. But they do take some of the stuff seriously. I think they get a lot of tips. And what happened was, to mark the 40th anniversary of the case starting, it started in '76. Last summer, they had a giant news conference and announced a new effort to catch him, and they put out a $50,000 reward, which is, to me, is nothing for that level of crime. You know, the amount of murders and rapes that he did, $50,000 in the state of California is peanuts. You know, so I wish that was bigger. I wish there was a way that they could, you know, because if it was, you know, if it was $100,000 or $250,000 or something, I think you'd have all kinds of tips coming in, you know, because I think that would motivate people. But, you know, unfortunately, that's what it is. But I would hope that somebody would come forward with information, not for the reward, but just, you know, help see the case solved.
And you're relatively confident that this is one person, not 2 or 3 people? Because I know that the sketches, you can find similarities between the sketches over the years, but they do look like a couple of different people. What's your opinion on that?
Those sketches are they weren't of him directly. They were of suspicious people seen around the scene of the crime at around the time of the crime. So they were just people of interest that they wanted to talk to and identify. As far as he, you know, the killer and the rapist, he was always known to wear a ski mask. And, you know, there's been a couple instances where he took it off and somebody saw part of his face, you know, things like that. But for the most part, he always had a ski mask on. So that's been one of the hard parts about the case. Now, one of these sketches could be him, but they just don't know for sure. That's why there's so many different sketches.
As I was looking into the case, kind of preparing for this interview, is the poem that he wrote, Excitement's Crave. And first part of my comment is that was written on my birthday, which was interesting to see. And the second part is, do you think that he was inspired? And this might be completely obvious. Do you personally think he was inspired by the Zodiac and the Zodiac's writings? And explain what the Excitement's Crave is.
Well, so the Excitement's Crave is a poem that he wrote, you know, allegedly wrote. I mean, there's some people say it's not really him that wrote it, but, you know, a demented outlook on who he was or whatever. I think that's, I'm not a poet, or, you know, I don't read poetry or whatever. So as far as commenting on how good it is, you know, I couldn't say. But in that case, there's you know, some of the writings, and there's more than that. There's some other writings in the case that were discovered at, you know, near one of the crime scenes that they use that they think would be his, and you can find them online. But they're possible clues. And a couple of people have said, I think he was inspired by the Zodiac, and he could have been, you know, if he was a a teenager or a little bit younger when Zodiac was active. Sacramento is not that far away from Vallejo in San Francisco, so he definitely probably would have heard about it, and I think maybe he was inspired a little bit, but he didn't go out of his way like Zodiac did to contact the press. I mean, there were a couple calls that he made that were probably him. There's some recordings of them calling into the police. But he didn't go out of his way to write a lot of letters like Zodiac did, taunting them. And their crimes are definitely different. Zodiac would find lone couples out, on a lover's lane someplace and randomly shoot them, whereas the Golden State Killer would target them for weeks in advance, months in advance. Sometimes he would make calls to them and just hang up or do heavy breathing and stuff like that ahead of time. And then, even more disturbing was after some of the crimes, he would call them back and taunt them with phone calls. So I think he was actually more interested in terrorizing the victims than he was taunting the police.
He would actually call the victims. He would stalk the victims, call them. When you're looking into the case, it's freaky. I mean, I'm like borderline really freaked out right now, because he would, you think back, it was like the late 70s, and you just have that like that image of the when a stranger calls, where the phone rings and the bell, like the phone is so goddamn loud and so jarring, and then you have this the Ray phone call that he made. Is Ray there, and it just turns, it's a wrong number, but it ends up being he's probably calling to make sure that these people are home that he's been stalking, or this woman's home that he's been stalking. It's freaky, and you think that was part of the adrenaline of it, and obviously it was, right?
I think he loved prowling and stalking, and he would go into these people's houses, and he would, ahead of time, he'd unlock certain windows. He would take firearms, guns that he found, and unload them, just so when he came in, these people would try and defend themselves, and all of a sudden their gun's not loaded. So, I mean, he would go in ahead of time, do this stuff, and then come back later on and attack them. So he spent weeks or months on certain victims and leading up to the attacks and then after the attacks. And some of the victims even moved, and he would later get a hold of their number somehow and reach back out and call them. So it's a scary case, the level that he went to and the amount of victims that he had. When I first started reading about this, I've always been safety conscious and security conscious, but literally since I looked into this case, I'm double checking every window and every door before I go to bed at night. The alarm's always on. Because it's just scary to think that this kind of person, is out there.
I'm pretty sure I saw the closet doors behind you move.
Now, it might be my cat. I hope it is. Maybe it'll freak me out.
No, your cat was on the other side of the frame.
Yeah, I don't know. He might be moving around, but I hope it's him.
Just check it before you go to bed.
Yeah, just finish the interview and then check it.
Yeah.
So do you have a theory on who the original Night Stalker Golden State Killer is?
I don't. I mean, I've got just a big list of people that were in that area. I have an idea from a profile standpoint of who I personally think he is, and I've got a list of people that meet that, but none, like in the Zodiac case, none that I can put my finger and say I think this was the guy. The guy that I turned in, and they felt strong enough to elevate him to DNA collection. I had a really good feeling about him, for a number of different reasons. And it was hard to get the news that he wasn't the guy, because I actually thought he could be the guy. But, like some people, when they get that news that their person of interest is not the guy, they just can't let go of it. And they're like, well, what if he was this? And what if he used a wig? And, they explain away different things of why that person wasn't the right guy. Whereas me, it's like flush them and then move on to the next one. So I try and keep an open mind when I'm doing this stuff.
This is the original Night Stalker, not to be confused with the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez. Why do you think Richard Ramirez is more of a household name than this original Night Stalker? Is it because he was caught and he had this personality to him?
I think it was the whole satanic, evil, angle to it, because I think back then Satanism was like, people were terrified of it, and heavy metal music back then, they were terrified that it was influencing people, and I think he used that spotlight to try and scare people, and I think that's what did it. And part of it's the names, because when the Golden State Killer started up in Sacramento with the rapes, he was known as the East Area Rapist. And when he moved down to Southern California, he was called the Night Stalker. But he was doing this before Richard Ramirez started doing his stuff. So that's why he's called the original Night Stalker, because they called him the Night Stalker before Richard Ramirez. But I think a combination of the two names in different parts of the state was kind of confusing. That's why more people hadn't heard of him. And then, it was a few years ago that Michelle McNamara is actually the one that came up with the name Golden State Killer. And that pretty much covered him across the board, and that's what a lot of people refer to him now as.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mike Morford. Check out truecrimeguy.com and zodiackillersite.com and the new podcast Criminology with Mike and Mike.
We could go on and on, but we really don't want to freak anybody out. The door did open behind you. Your closet door did open. Just
starting to freak me out now. Okay, I was going to say.